Gonna sneeze. Excuse me. Hey backpacking fans, Ghost Mule here. Today we're going to do something a little different. It is a beautiful day here in Montana, and unfortunately I do not have a way to get up into the mountains to go hiking. So I decided to utilize a little unknown trail out here and do kind of an urban interface hike. So we're going to travel through some neighborhoods here and find the trail. It's going to take us up to the top of the rim rocks up there, get a nice little view of the city, and then maybe duck back down and grab some coffee. Could be interesting, especially with all the people watching the idiot filming himself walking through the neighborhoods. Now while I'm out on this little walk slash hike, I wanted to talk a little bit about how my experience growing up, as well as my experience growing up in backpacking, have kind of shown correlation with some of the interesting trends that I see in backpacking currently. All right, made it to the trail. All right, so you're probably already wondering just what is this guy talking about? How is growing up backpacking going to correlate with current backpacking stuff? Well, bear with me. I'll get to that in a minute. But first, we're gonna do a little bit of a history lesson. So I was born in Ohio in the late 70s. And if you paid attention to social media a lot lately, you know that puts me square at the end of Generation X. There's been a lot of talk recently about the different generations and how they do or don't relate to each other. Well, most of that conversation has been around the differences between the boomers and the millennials. Now, of course, the main impetus between, or the main reason behind that comparison is the dramatic differences there exist between the boomer generation and millennials, mainly dealing with the digital world and world outlooks and things like that. But what usually gets overlooked is the fact that there is a generation of misguided latchkey children out there that sandwiched in between the two of them called Generation X. This guy. So Generation X has a distinct pleasure of being that generation that grew up starting out life before the digital generation and now navigating our midlife crises through that said digital generation. It's fun. And generally the idea is that Generation X doesn't like either of the generations that came before or after it. I don't know if that's true, but sometimes I wonder. Now for me personally, because I was born in the 70s, I became a teenager in the 90s. Incidentally, that's also when I started getting into backpacking really heavily. Those of you that got involved in backpacking in the 90s, you know that we all got to get introduced into it in that magical time period of growth in the outdoor industry in general, and specifically in backpacking. Since backpacking became really more mainstream in about the 50s, there hasn't been a period of growth that's even come close to matching the period of growth during the 1990s. Everybody, it seems, was getting back in touch with their natural roots. Gonna sneeze. Excuse me. So this, of course, was brought on by things like TV shows such as Northern Exposure and other things that were bringing living in the natural world more into the mainstream. Books such as Into the Wild, which came out in 1992, towards the end of the 90s, in A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. Pretty titular books that generally introduced the natural world to a lot of people who during the 70s and 80s had become detached from them. And of course it included things like the starting and growing environmental movement. All of these things led to a very interesting experience during the 90s, and you started seeing people walking around in their Teva sandals and their Timberline boots and their nice new Patagonia Snap Micro D fleeces or puffy vests. They were everywhere. 20 teen college students, your generation was not, I repeat, not the first one to rock outdoor gear like it was everyday wear. Holy crap. Okay, this is a good spot for a water break. So as I said, this is also during a time period where I started to become more active in backpacking. So for me, the beginning of my backpacking career started in the mid-90s when I was in my mid-teens and I was getting ready for a big trip out west in New Mexico. 10 days of backpacking, and for an Ohio kid, that's a pretty big chore. So of course, I needed to get some gear. So of course, back in the 90s, the gear is quite a bit different. See, we were still kind of back in that age-old age of vintage gear. Sure, external frame backpacks had kind of started to fall to the side for internal frame backpacks, but we, generally speaking, were still using stuff that had been used for decades by this point. So the first pack I ever owned, because packs are kind of a big deal in backpacking, was an old 1990s era North Face Badlands internal frame pack. Sure, it was an internal frame pack, but this thing had so much padding on it, it was like being strapped into a whole car seat. Now that pack was made out of ballistic grade Cordura nylon and probably weighed by itself 12 pounds. And back in the day, it was hot shit gear. Now to round out my not quite vintage gear splendor, I had full-on all grain leather lug sole boots, a Ultralight MSR camp stove, cotton BDU pants, Snap D fleece, a Thermarest self-inflating pad, an old-fashioned Boy Scout A-frame tent with solid aluminum poles, and a brand new psychedelically colored 1990s era North Face Cat's Meow synthetic sleeping bag. I was pretty hot shit, and my pack probably weighed in excess of 50 pounds. So clearly, at this point in my backpacking career, the word ultralight wasn't even in my vocabulary. But unbeknownst to those of us in my backpacking circle, the ultralight revolution was lurking in the shadows, just like a hungry marmot waiting to raid your bear bag. You see, we didn't know it yet, but in the 1990s, a paradigm shift was coming along in the backpacking community that would do nothing short of just demolish the long-held beliefs of generations of backpackers and basically create ongoing debate to this very day, some 20 plus years later. You see, a bunch of thru hikers out there in the 90s were starting to realize that maybe there was an easier way to do things, and maybe we could start changing our gear to, well, make our lives a little bit easier. And so they did. Now, like any major shift in things, it does happen gradually and it took some time. But in my opinion, there were a few really big benchmarks that kind of showed the progression of this new methodology. One of the first big changes and ventures into the ultralight backpacking community was the publishing of Beyond Backpacking by Ray Jardine. This book originally came out all the way back in 1992, although this is the 2002 edition. And although back in 1992, this movement was still pretty underground, like a bunch of teenagers getting ready to TP somebody's unfortunate house on the corner, but it was still there, and it was starting to grow. Now, the next big change in the ultralight backpacking community would come along in the early 2000s. And this was when ultralight backpacking went from a cult status into more the mainstream and was introduced to more people. And that, of course, would be during the time of YouTube and YouTube backpacking channels. Though I'm not sure why anybody would believe those guys. Now, although ultralight backpacking was starting to become more accepted by the mainstream, very true to my personality, I was once again late to the party. In fact, I didn't start cutting my teeth on ultralight until after I had already moved out west and after I had started working in the industry. I was still shopping around a pretty decently sized Osprey Aether backpack, as well as mid-height shoes. And I was still using that same Ultralight I had all the way back in 1996. So for me, the big change happened when I started palling around with a guy who had already hiked the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail. You guys probably know him, Shadow. And he slowly but surely infected me with the ever-growing disease known as ultralight backpacking. Now, for full disclosure, I don't consider myself to be a true dyed-in-the-wool ultralight backpacker, but I have definitely started going in that direction with the gear choices that I've been making recently. And it's been very interesting because it has led me to what I believe is the third paramount change that has created a growing and ever expanding repertoire of ultralight backpacking in the community. And that, of course, is going to be the growing proliferation and ease of accessibility to Cottage brand industries that are making ever increasingly sophisticated and specialized gear for the backpacking community. Oh boy. So you see, back in my day, when I wanted to order gear, we were still using those newsprint Campmore catalogs and calling people up on the phone and ordering things that way, or going to our local store. For me, that was a place in Dayton, Ohio called General Surplus, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. And although I personally still think that going to local stores and shopping is still a very important thing, there are a lot of places out there that are making it easier to track down the ultralight Cottage brands. Companies like Garage Grown Gear is introducing more and more backpackers to companies such as Z-Packs, Waymark Gear Company, Hilltop Packs, Gossamer Gear. So many of them, it's hard to even name all of them. Enlightened Equipment, there's tons of them. That brings us up to current speed. We now have a lot of people that are switching over into the ultralight community. But me, being a Gen Xer, just like I'm sandwiched between two very radically different generations, the boomers and the millennials, I'm also sandwiched between the fact that I started out being a traditional backpacker with traditional gear and boots and packs and such, and then switching into a more of a ultralighter. And so that is where I feel like my experience as a Gen Xer kind of parallels my backpacking experience, because I don't really fall into one category or the other. And just like a Gen Xer who kind of sort of knows how to technology, I watch a lot of times on social media the different arguments that occur between those who are unwilling to change from the old styles and give up the gear and methodologies that they've always known, and those that have made the decision to go into the ultralighting community and have really embraced it. Sometimes a little too much. Sometimes that Kool-Aid tastes really good. On one side of the coin, you have the hard-headed, stubborn, this is how I've always done it and this is how I'm always going to do it camp, with their sometimes still using external frame packs or really large heavy internal frame packs, their lug sole boots, their liquid fuel stoves, and all of that jazz. And on the other hand, you have the frankly kind of arrogant, stuck-up ultralighters that probably have their titanium spork shoved a little too far up there. So at this point, you are no doubt waiting with bated breath and comment typing hands at the ready to flame me depending on what my answer is, and wondering just what my answer is. So which one is it? Which one's right? Which camp do I think is the one that is the most right? I'll let you in on a little secret. They're both right. Yep, newsflash. I don't think either camp is right, and I don't think either camp is wrong. Because you see, I don't think backpacking is a competitive sport, but sometimes we seem to try to make it that way. It always seems like it's gear that they choose to make it a competitive edge. I don't get it. The reality is that at the end of the day, what works for you is what works for you, and it doesn't matter what the other person uses. So why are we always so concerned about telling the other person that their gear is right or wrong? It just isn't fun. Now, don't get me wrong, I love a good gear debate, and I'll gladly throw down any day. But that's if the person invites me into the conversation. I'm not gonna walk up to somebody in camp and say, oh man, is that a such and such tent? Hey, that's a dumb tent. I don't know why you went with that one. I know it seems kind of odd, but believe it or not, it happens all the time. And as I slowly make my way back into the neighborhood so I can stop filming and not look like a nutcase in front of all my neighbors, I'm just gonna end with this. Just like our generational gaps that we generally should be getting over, we also need to get over it in the backpacking community. Gear is gear. What works for one person doesn't work for another person. That's why still to this day, my least favorite question I get in the store is, well, what do you use? Because I don't advocate everybody use what I use. Even on this channel, I'm gonna review the stuff that I use because, well, it's what I use and it's what I know. But it may not be the best choice. It probably doesn't seem very helpful, but it is what it is. Because frankly speaking, sometimes it gets kind of ugly. I once had to leave a vintage backpacking group because one of the people on there was so adamantly defensive about using an external frame pack that even when I said, wow, it's really cool that you do that, he jumped all over me and just was throwing things down. And before I could even get a chance to say, hey man, I was just complimenting you. I know I use something different, but I respect the fact that you use something different as well. Why? Because he was so used to people doing exactly that, criticizing what he used. Cool, prickly pear. So at the end of the day, the confession of this Gen Xer is, do whatever makes you happy. Choose the gear that makes your life easiest and run with it. And if you have the opportunity to criticize somebody else's gear without their permission, don't. That's a jerk move. Be nice to everybody out there. Enjoy the rest of your day. And as always, keep hiking on.